They were supposed to be back by Monday. That was the plan. A long weekend in Alaska, one final escape into the wild before winter locked the world away. But Monday came, and nothing. No calls. No checkout. Just silence. Tessa Sullivan and Finn Hoffman weren't reckless travelers. They were experienced, prepared, and deeply respectful of the outdoors. She was a passionate wildlife photographer, always chasing the perfect frame. He was a quiet observer, filming their travels, fascinated with forgotten trails and folded maps. They had driven up from Oregon to explore the Kenai Peninsula. Their destination, Cooper Landing, a quiet, remote slice of Alaska where the mountains tower and cell signals vanish. Locals remembered them clearly. Tessa, radiant and full of questions. Finn, quiet, camera always nearby. They had asked about hiking trails, specifically one, Slaughter Gulch, a trail not for beginners. Steep, brutal, and winding through unforgiving elevation gain, but also beautiful, isolated, and completely off-grid. It was the kind of place that lured people who wanted to disappear for a little while and maybe didn't plan to stay gone. The couple never returned to the lodge. Their room was untouched, luggage still packed, the bed still made. The front desk waited a day before calling. By Tuesday morning, they knew something was wrong. They tried calling both phones. Straight to voicemail. They checked local hospitals. No one matching their description had come in. The gray Ford Escape they'd rented was nowhere to be seen. The search started quietly. A few troopers, local volunteers. But it escalated fast. Alaska doesn't give second chances. State troopers combed the area. Helicopters flew grid patterns over the treetops. Dogs were deployed. Nothing. No tire tracks. No footprints. No cell data. No sign of distress. No goodbye. The leading theory was the simplest. An accident. Lost in the woods. Injured. Maybe hypothermia. Maybe a fall. But even that had cracks. If they'd headed for the trail, why was there no record of them reaching the start? Why hadn't their phones pinged a tower somewhere nearby? Why not leave a note at the lodge? Then came the second theory. More sinister. A criminal encounter. Robbery. Abduction. A carjacking gone wrong. A chance meeting with the wrong person. But violence against strangers in this part of Alaska? Incredibly rare. Still, nothing could be ruled out. The weather didn't help. Crisp autumn air turned quickly into bitter rain. Trails became sludge. Slopes collapsed under heavy footfall. Searchers advanced just feet per hour, shouting their names into a forest that seemed to absorb sound. Dogs struggled to trace anything in the wet, scent saturated underbrush. Volunteers burned through their energy and morale. Every cracked twig was treated like a revelation. Every discarded wrapper inspected like evidence. But none of it led anywhere. The land was too big, too silent, too willing to swallow people whole. Then a spark. On day 8, a small gas station 60 miles south of Cooper Landing called in. The attendant, Walter, claimed he'd seen them days before the search hit the news. A young man with a mustache, a dark-haired woman, asking questions about back roads, seemed lost, bought coffee and a paper map of the Kenai Peninsula. He thought they were driving a gray SUV, possibly a Ford. The lead seemed shaky. No date, no receipts, just a memory. The station security system, outdated and unreliable, had corrupted all footage from the day in question. Nothing usable, just static. One bright lead, dead on arrival. But it was the only real direction they'd had. 2 troopers had already spent a day chasing it. And now it had cost them time, energy, and morale. Back at base, the maps on the wall were thick with red marker. Cleared sectors. Hundreds of man-hours logged. 0 evidence found. October crept in. Temperatures dropped below freezing. The first snow clung to the mountain peaks. Then the lower hills. Then the forest floor. The window was closing. On October 17th, with a foot of snow in the upper passes and ice hardening the rivers, Sergeant Miles Corian made the call. The search was being suspended. The words were wrapped in official language. Indefinitely, pending new information, transitioning to open case status. But everyone understood what it meant. Winter had won. The volunteers went home. The media left. The command post shut down. Alaska did what Alaska does. It buried the story beneath its silence. For the families back in Oregon, the loss was no longer sharp and panicked. It was dull, endless, a kind of grief without a shape, a story with no ending. And Alaska, now cloaked in white, held its secrets close. Months passed. 9 months. The winter of 2022 to 2023 came and went. The snow began to melt. Trees budded. Rivers swelled with meltwater. The landscape transformed from ice to color in just weeks. But the case? Still frozen. Tessa and Finn were just a name on a cold case file. Their story, nothing more than a tragic mystery swallowed by wilderness. Until June 5th, 2023. A routine patrol deep in the Kenai National Wildlife Refuge was about to change everything. And what it uncovered would not bring answers. Only horror. June 5th, 2023. 9 months after Tessa Sullivan and Finn Hoffman vanished into the Alaskan wild, Park Ranger Elias Vance was miles from anything, deep in the backcountry of the Kenai National Wildlife Refuge. He wasn't there looking for the couple. That case, in most minds, was already buried, officially inactive, unofficially dead. Vance was performing routine checks on bear baiting stations. A technical but essential job. Alaska's black bear hunting season was near, and permits for baiting were tightly regulated. Each station had to follow strict rules, where what, how much. Station KB-117 sat far off any maintained road, known to rangers as a headache, frequently violated, frequently ignored. Vance knew it by reputation. He parked his patrol truck. When the road ended, hiked the rest on foot. The woods were thick, the air still. Sunlight struggled through the spruce canopy. His boots crunched quietly over moss and pine needles. Then the smell hit him. At first, it was just a foul sweetness, rotting sugar maybe, but there was more to it. Fermentation, a sour chemical undertone. Sickly, wrong. Vance slowed, senses on edge. He'd smelled this before. Not food, not bait, something else. He stepped into a small clearing and stopped dead. At the center was a large, industrial-sized blue plastic barrel, knocked on its side. From its open mouth spilled a grotesque avalanche of decomposing pastries. Hundreds, maybe thousands, of donuts, bear claws, jelly-filled squares, now fused into a wet, reeking mass. Intermixed was a river of feed corn, moldy, swarming with flies. The pile shimmered with insects. Flies, wasps, hornets. The buzz was overwhelming. The sight bizarre, unnatural, not just a baiting violation. Something deeply wrong. Vance reached for the bear spray on his belt. A pile like this could draw a grizzly from miles. He scanned the tree lean. Stillness. Silence. Circling the pile, Vance kept his eyes locked on the barrel. It was too clean, too bright. Its blue surface looked alien against the muted greens and browns. And then he saw it. 2 hiking boots. Black, protruding from fermenting slurry inside the barrel. Upright, motionless, attached to legs in dark, mud-caked hiking pants. Half submerged in donuts and corn. The smell turned sharp. Human decay. Vance stumbled back. The moment twisted in his gut. He forced down the instinct to run. He backed away slowly, careful not to disturb the scene. Pulled the radio from his vest. Called it in. 10:54. A body deep in the forest. Inside a bait barrel. Surrounded by rot. The dispatcher's voice was calm. Reassuring. Help was en route. Vance waited. 40 minutes. The longest of his life. He stood at the edge of the clearing, eyes fixed on the barrel. Rifle slung but ready. Bear spray in hand. The buzzing of flies was relentless. Like something alive. Like a scream that couldn't be heard. Sergeant Miles Corian arrived with the first wave of troopers. He hadn't expected to reopen this case. But there it was. A body in the forest. A man in hiking gear. 9 months after Tessa and Finn vanished. And it wasn't an animal attack. Not even close. The forensic team flew in the next morning. They documented everything. The placement of the barrel, the pattern of the corn, the saturation of the flies. Every inch of the ground was photographed. Then they removed the body. It was male, decomposed but fully clothed, still wearing a hiking pack. The smell choked with chemical rot. No obvious wounds. No ID, but everyone had a guess. 2 days later, the confirmation arrived. Dental records made it official. It was Finn Hoffman, but that was only the beginning. The autopsy revealed 2 devastating facts. First, cause of death, massive blunt force trauma to the back of the skull. Not a fall, not an accident. A killing blow, intentional, final. Second, the body had not decomposed for 9 months. Far from it. The forensic report estimated exposure to the elements at no more than 2 weeks. Finn Hoffman had been frozen, preserved, held somewhere cold and dark for nearly 8 months, then dumped. Everything the investigators had assumed. Wrong. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't misadventure. It was a homicide. And someone had tried to cover it up in the most grotesque way imaginable, stuffing his body into a bait barrel, hoping wildlife would destroy the evidence. That one discovery shattered the case and rebuilt it in an entirely new image. The wilderness hadn't swallowed the couple. A killer had. And if Finn had been murdered and stored like meat, then where was Tessa? A wave of cold dread swept through the Alaska State Trooper's office. For 9 months, they'd chased shadows in the woods. Now, they were hunting something far more dangerous. Someone had lured or intercepted that couple, murdered one, held the other, or worse. Tessa was no longer missing. She was either dead or still out there, and the clock had already ticked far too long. With the discovery of Finn Hoffman's body inside a barrel of rotting pastries, the investigation flipped overnight. The command center in Soldotna roared back to life. The maps went back up, the pins were reset, but this time, the objective wasn't rescue. It was justice. Now, they weren't looking for lost hikers. They were tracking a killer. And every detail at that grotesque bait station became a potential thread. The barrel, the type of feed corn, the overkill mountain of expired donuts. One piece stood out. Each baiting station in Alaska is registered to a name. The one where Finn was found, KB-117, belonged to a man named Silas Croft. The name rang a bell. Croft was a 58-year-old hunting outfitter, known to local law enforcement, not for violence, but for cutting corners, bending the rules on permits. A classic backwoods type, grizzled, solitary, and uncooperative when pushed. Corian sent 2 troopers to bring him in for questioning. Croft showed up at the Soldotna post with a glare that could cut wood. He didn't ask why he was there. He already knew. He sat across from Corian with his arms crossed, jaw tight. He confirmed the station was his. Yes, but he claimed he hadn't visited it since the previous fall. He insisted he'd stopped using KB-117 because people had started piggybacking, using established bait sites without permission. Croft said he'd long given up trying to police it. People dumped whatever they wanted, donuts, dog food, bacon grease. It wasn't worth the trouble. Corian asked where he'd been in the last 2 weeks, when the body was most likely dumped. Croft's answer was muddy. Said he was working on gear, tuning a snow machine, cutting firewood, alone, no receipts, no digital footprint, no one to verify anything. It wasn't suspicious, not exactly, but it was frustratingly convenient. Croft gave permission to search his property, his cabin, his truck. Nothing. No blood. No traces of Finn or Tessa. No leftover bait. No freezer that could have stored a body. He was still on the board, but without hard evidence, he remained just a name. Not the name. The trail bent again. This time to the physical evidence. The forensic team zeroed in on the barrel. A standard 55-gallon industrial drum, scuffed, weathered, but intact. A faded stamp near the bottom caught a technician's eye. Under magnification and high-intensity light, they managed to make it out. Castaloff Seafoods, a fish processing plant, defunct for over 10 years. It had gone bankrupt. Its assets auctioned off. Machinery, storage bins, and barrels like this one. A clue so cold, it might have meant nothing, until the donuts came under the scope. Among the pile of decayed sweets, one pastry stood out, a square-shaped, raspberry-filled item with a sugar-dusted top. Unusual, distinct, not mass-produced by every bakery. The state crime lab traced it back to a specific wholesale bakery in Anchorage. It was a thread, thin, fragile, but finally traceable. Corian assigned 2 of his best investigators to track it. They started at the bakery and pulled the distribution records. Then they went door to door. Grocery stores, gas stations, corner marts, from Kenai to Homer. They were searching for any business that carried that specific pastry and may have sold or lost a suspicious quantity. But the haystack was huge and the needle elusive. Most managers were polite but clueless. Records didn't go back far enough. Staff turnover made things worse. Some didn't stock the pastry at all. The promising lead was dissolving into static. The clues so far felt like surreal puzzle pieces. A defunct seafood company, 1,000 decomposing donuts, a missing woman, and a man whose corpse had been kept on ice like inventory. It wasn't coming together. And as a forensic team hit walls, the Alaskan wilderness opened up again. Snow melted, rivers surged, and the long daylight hours gave way to increased foot traffic in the woods. People were out fishing, hiking, boating. And on July 10th, a break finally came, not from DNA or surveillance footage, but from the glassy surface of a remote lake. 2 brothers from Anchorage, seasoned fishermen, were spending a long weekend chasing lake trout. They had chosen Tushumina Lake, known for its depth, its size, and its unforgiving isolation. Rather than use the main boat launch, they had taken a series of rugged logging roads, using a satellite map to find a hidden cove along the lake's southern edge. As they pushed their aluminum boat into the still water, one of the brothers paused. Something shimmered below the surface, about 30 yards out, metal, angular. At first, they thought it was an old snow machine, maybe scrap metal, but the shape became clearer as the sun rose. Rectangular, symmetrical, it looked like the roof of a car. Their hearts dropped. They remembered the news. The couple, the missing Ford escape. They dialed 911 with shaking fingers, trying to explain a location that barely existed on any map. Within hours, Corian had the call on his desk. The coordinates were 50 miles from Slaughter Gulch, where Tessa and Finn had told people they were going, and 30 miles from the bait station, where Finn's body was found. The geometry didn't make sense. It was a triangle drawn by madness. A specialized dive team arrived the same day. They slipped into the icy water with helmet cams rolling. Visibility was crystal clear. The vehicle was there, a gray SUV, upright, resting peacefully as though parked on a lake bed. The license plate was still intact. It was Finn and Tessa's rental Ford Escape. The vehicle was pulled from the lake the next day, covered in weeds, stinking, its interior soaked and disintegrated. But one thing had survived, the factory-installed GPS system. While the display was dead, the solid-state memory had been sealed. The unit was sent to the state's digital forensic lab. Everyone waited. When the call came, it changed everything. The GPS system showed the couple's route on their last day, September 9th, 2022, and it never went near Slaughter Gulch. Instead, it led down a series of logging roads straight to Tushumina Lake. The SUV had been driven, not dumped, placed at the very edge of the cove, and the final GPS pings occurred right at the boundary of a large, privately owned tract of land. One name was listed as the property owner, Alastair Finch. No one on the case had ever heard of him, but that was about to change. Because when Sergeant Corian pulled the old auction records from the Castleoff Seafoods bankruptcy, one name appeared among the buyers, Finch. He had purchased 3 pallets of miscellaneous equipment, including plastic barrels, the same kind used to hold a body in the forest. The forest, the barrel, the donuts, the lake, the SUV, they were all pointing in one direction now, straight to the recluse living in the woods. The real story had only just begun. The name Alastair Finch had, until now, meant nothing. It wasn't on any missing persons list. No known criminal history. No record of prior run-ins with law enforcement. No fingerprints in any criminal database. He was, in every sense of the word, a ghost. But ghosts don't buy land. Ghosts don't pay taxes. And ghosts don't show up in decade-old bankruptcy auctions buying plastic barrels by the pallet. Sergeant Corian sat in silence as the name echoed in his mind, now tethered to two of the most chilling discoveries in Alaskan crime history: a body in a barrel and a car at the bottom of a glacial lake. He typed the name into the state's property registry. Finch owned one parcel, 120 acres of dense, remote forest land just south of Tushumina Lake. He'd purchased it 2 decades earlier. Paid cash. That was the only thing about Finch that was ordinary. No social media. No driver's license renewals. No fishing or hunting licenses. No medical records. No tax filings aside from property taxes. He had no phone listed, no utilities on record, and no known relatives. It was like he didn't exist beyond his cabin. That kind of disappearance isn't accidental. It's curated, chosen. Corian needed more. He dispatched a trooper to the nearest small town, Kislov, just 15 miles as a crow flies from Finch's land. The town had one post office, one general store, and maybe 24 locals who'd lived there long enough to remember when Finch first appeared. The postmaster remembered the name. So did the general store owner. But not well. Finch came into town maybe once every 3 or 4 weeks. He paid in cash, kept his head down, avoided eye contact, didn't talk unless it was necessary, and even then, just the bare minimum. Locals said he was off, not in a criminal way, just wary, thin, pale, looked like he hadn't smiled in years. There were rumors, always are in towns like this. Some said he'd moved to Alaska after losing his family, wife and child, in a car accident somewhere in the lower 48. Others said he was former military, too damaged by what he'd seen to ever rejoin society. Some claimed he had booby traps on his land, man traps, warning shots. Nobody had proof. Nobody wanted to test it either. Whatever the truth was, Alistair Finch had buried it deep in the woods, behind brambles, broken trails, and a mountain of silence. But now, the silence was cracking. Corian laid out the evidence. A body in a barrel. A GPS log ending at the edge of Finch's land. A matching plastic drum linked to the seafood auction Finch had bought from. It was enough. He compiled the affidavit with surgical precision. He knew a defense attorney could poke holes if he didn't stitch everything tight. The judge signed the warrant without hesitation. The raid was set for dawn. 6 state troopers, 2 from the tactical unit, met at a staging point 5 miles from Finch's property. The plan was simple. Quiet approach. Minimal noise. No warning. They would take the logging roads until vehicles became useless, then proceed on foot. As the sun broke over the treetops, they moved out. The property had no gate, just a rusted "No trespassing" sign nailed to a dying spruce tree. The path beyond was barely a trail, just a depression in the moss where tires had once passed. Finch's cabin was buried in a clearing dense with alder and fireweed. Smoke drifted lazily from a chimney. Someone was home. Corian called out, identified himself, said they had a warrant. Silence. He called again, louder. Still nothing. Then movement inside. The tactical team stack counted down and breached. Inside the cabin, they found Alistair Finch sitting at a small wooden table, a tin cup steaming in his hands. He didn't flinch, didn't protest, just looked up with a hollow expression, as though he had known, truly known, this moment would come. The troopers moved fast. 2 secured Finch. The others began the search. The cabin was a time capsule of solitary living. Canned goods, a shortwave radio, weather books on wilderness survival and animal tracking. There were no photos, no mementos, nothing that tied him to any other human being. Behind the cabin, in a rickety shed, they found a large commercial-grade chest freezer. It was running. The hum filled the tight space. A trooper lifted the lid. Empty, but it had been scrubbed. Recently, inexpertly, they sprayed the interior with luminol. The blue-green glow lit up like a star field. Blood, a lot of it. Still no sign of Tessa. Then came the padlock storage locker built into the side of the main cabin. Bolt cutters did the job. The door swung open, revealing a narrow, mildew-slicked chamber filled with old tarps and rotting camping gear. And in the back, half covered in moss-stained cloth, was a small dirt-caked backpack, faded turquoise. The moment Corian saw it, he knew. Tessa Sullivan. Inside the pack were snack wrappers, a broken flashlight, and a wallet. Her ID was still inside. With that single item, everything changed. No more whispers. No more shadows. The suspect was no longer just a man at the end of a string of circumstantial clues. He was now in possession of the belongings of a missing woman whose boyfriend had been found murdered on a property he could reach by foot. Finch's mask cracked. Corian placed the backpack on the table in front of him. For the first time, Finch reacted. A slow, shuddering sigh escaped his lips. His shoulders slumped. His eyes dimmed even further. And then he spoke, not in anger, not in panic, just a dry, flat voice, like someone reading a eulogy they'd written for themselves. He told them what happened on September 9th. He'd heard an engine near the edge of his property. It was unusual. No one ever came this deep into the forest. He approached with his rifle, always carried it. It was habit, not hostility. He found the ford escape, stuck in mud. A young man and woman, Finn and Tessa, were trying to dig it out. They saw him, looked relieved, asked for help. A phone, a tow, but Finch said no, told him to get off his land. Finn snapped, yelled at him, stepped forward. Finch claimed it wasn't premeditated, said it all happened too fast. He raised a rifle not to shoot but to swing, struck Finn in the back of the head. He went down instantly. Tessa screamed. Finch forced her back to the cabin, locked her inside. He said he dragged Finn's body to the shed and stuffed him into the freezer. The next day, he drove the escape to the lake, let it roll into the water, watched it sink. He kept Tessa in the cabin. Through the fall, through the dead of winter, said she became part of the secret, someone who knew too much, someone he couldn't let go. Then in May, she escaped, slipped out a window while he was chopping wood. He looked for her, for a day, maybe two, but then gave up. Panicked, he took Finn's frozen body and dumped it at a bait station, hoped the bears would take care of it. But they didn't. And now he was here, at the end of the road he'd paved with paranoia and silence. What he didn't know, what he refused to admit, was that Tessa hadn't just vanished into the forest. She had fought to survive. And somewhere, out there in the shadows of that unforgiving land, lay the final piece of the truth. Tessa Sullivan was gone. That much, Alistair Finch admitted. She'd escaped through a window in May, after months locked away in his cabin. He claimed he searched for her for a day, maybe two, but then he gave up. She was lost to the forest. He said the wild would take her. That was his assumption. That was his hope. But Sergeant Corian didn't take assumptions as truth. Not anymore. Tessa wasn't just missing. She was out there, somewhere. And now, this wasn't just a criminal investigation. It was a recovery mission, a promise to bring her home. The confession had changed the stakes and the terrain. No longer were they combing the vast Kenai Peninsula, chasing rumors and shadows. They had a single point of origin now, the cabin. From there, they plotted the likeliest direction Tessa would have run. Corian established a 5-mile search radius around the property. A daunting stretch of dense forest, swampy muskeg, collapsed animal trails, and sheer, punishing terrain. It was brutal, but necessary. They weren't hoping for a miracle. They were hunting for closure. The teams were small, tight-knit, and methodical. K-9 units trained in cadaver detection. Park Service trackers. Volunteers from search and rescue. Local troopers who knew how to read the land like a map carved in pine and stone. Every broken branch. Every shift in the moss. Every faint scent carried on the wind. It all meant something. The effort consumed weeks. They worked in silence. Rain fell. Bugs swarmed. The sun hung for hours, never really setting in Alaska's endless summer. They pressed on. The only thing louder than the silence was a question none of them voiced. What was it like being Tessa? What did she see when she fled that cabin? What did she feel when she realized she was alone, weak, starving, and miles from anything resembling help? What did it take to survive, even for a few days? And how far did she make it? On August 2nd, a search team broke through a particularly thick section of undergrowth in a wooded ravine nearly 4 miles northeast of Finch's cabin. The slope was steep, the footing treacherous. One of the cadaver dogs gave a signal. Ears perked, nose stiff, body frozen. They paused, waited. Then came the alert bark. Beneath a massive fallen spruce tree, wedged between the gnarled root system, and a crumbling outcrop of granite, they saw it. A shelter, rudimentary, crude, but deliberate. Branches had been broken, shaped into a low triangle, packed with moss and old bark. It had taken time to build. Time and desperation. Inside, they found her. What was left of her? Skeletal remains. Weathered, but not scattered. She had died there, alone, quietly. Dental records confirmed it was Tessa Sullivan. Her final resting place wasn't the bottom of a lake or the inside of a freezer. It was a dark, mossy hollow in the forest, built with her own hands. A place she had fought to stay alive. Beside her were remnants of her backpack, empty food wrappers, scattered berries, a makeshift water container fashioned from birch bark and plastic. There were no signs of a struggle, no evidence of violence. The medical examiner and a forensic anthropologist conclude the cause of death as a combination of hypothermia and starvation. She had survived for days, maybe even a week, but it wasn't enough. Her captor didn't kill her with a weapon. He killed her with time. He killed her the moment he locked that cabin door behind her and called it survival. Back at the station, when Sergeant Corian received the report, he didn't speak for a full minute. There was no triumph, no sense of completion, just a dull, aching weight of what had been lost. Tessa's family was notified. The words came carefully, wrapped in layers of sorrow. Her father cried. Her sister screamed. Her mother collapsed to the floor. They had wanted to believe in the miracle. The wilderness was vast. People had survived longer and worse. But the miracle never came. Tessa Sullivan had died a prisoner of the forest, even after she escaped the cabin, and all they could do now was bring her home. The media reported the discovery the next day. Photos of Tessa and Finn, the smiling couple from Oregon, bright-eyed and eager for adventure, were everywhere. Headlines screamed closure. But that wasn't what anyone felt, because the story had gone from mystery to nightmare. A couple lost on a hike had become the victims of something far darker. They hadn't taken a wrong turn. They had found the worst kind of man, a man who'd isolated himself so thoroughly that he could destroy 2 lives, and think the wilderness would bury it. But the forest, in the end, gave her back. The moss, the trees, the cold ground. They had held Tessa for nearly a year. And then they let her go. The last chapter of her journey wasn't one of survival, but of resilience. She fled. She endured. She built shelter. She clung to life in the teeth of the wild. And even in her final days, she left behind a story that could now be told. The courtroom was cold, not physically, but emotionally. No whispers, no tension, just a suffocating, sterile silence. It was as if everyone was waiting for something they didn't want to hear. Alistair Finch, the man who had kept a woman captive for months, who had murdered her partner, who had tried to let nature clean up his crime, sat slumped in his seat like a ghost. Thin, hollow, washed out by years of self-imposed isolation and the sudden glare of public scrutiny. There were no outbursts, no angry protests. He said nothing at first, not when the charges were read, not when the photos were shown, not even when Tessa's father took the stand, his voice cracking as he described the daughter he had raised, the same daughter who built her own shelter and tried to outlast a wilderness while her captor drank coffee beside a fireplace. Finch sat motionless, a blank canvas, as though none of it touched him. But it did. Deep down, behind the distant stare and weathered face, something cracked. Maybe it was the photos of the turquoise backpack. Maybe it was hearing Finn's name repeated over and over again. Victim 1, blunt force trauma, homicide. Maybe it was a realization that the solitude he so carefully built had finally betrayed him, because just before the trial was set to enter its third day, Alastair Finch changed everything. He stood quietly and spoke. "I did it." 3 words. Flat, dry, but final. He pled guilty to all charges. First-degree murder for Finn Hoffman, felony murder for the death of Tessa Sullivan, kidnapping, tampering with evidence. The courtroom didn't erupt. No cheers, no gasps, just the exhale of something long held, a breath everyone had been too afraid to release. The plea meant there would be no trial, no drawn-out rehashing of the timeline, no cross-examinations, no weeks of torment for the families, just sentencing. And that, too, came quickly. The judge didn't flinch. No speech, no theatrics, just life in prison, without the possibility of parole, a lifetime of isolation, but not the kind Finch had chosen. Now, his world would be concrete and bars, security cameras and guards, doors that locked behind him, not ones he bolted shut himself. He would never again breathe the pine-heavy air of his forest, never again walk those logging roads, never again vanish into the background of a town that barely noticed him. Justice, in the strictest sense, had been served. But the families? They didn't feel it. Justice doesn't erase trauma. It doesn't rewind time. Doesn't let a mother hug her daughter again or a brother hear his siblings laugh. Justice here was just the end of the story, not the beginning of healing. In the months that followed, there would be vigils, 2 memorials, one in Oregon, one in Alaska. Photos of Tessa and Finn were mounted on easels, smiling, young, bright, with the kind of energy that made you believe the world still had wonder in it. People came, strangers, friends, hikers, troopers, even a few locals who had once seen Finch in town, never knowing what he'd done. The forest around Kenai grew quiet again. Tourists returned. Search teams dissolved. The maps were rolled up and shelved. But for the people who lived it, who walked those woods, heard those screams in their heads, stared into that blue barrel, they would never be the same. And neither would we, because this wasn't a story about getting lost. It was about what happens when you find the wrong person, when the trail leads not to a summit or a scenic overlook, but into the warped mind of a man who mistook isolation for safety and paranoia for power. The case of Tessa Sullivan and Finn Hoffman didn't end with their killer's confession. It ended with the silence he left behind. But if there's one thing Alaska taught us, it's that the wilderness remembers everything, and eventually it gives up its secrets. Alastair Finch didn't begin his life as a monster. There were no childhood crimes, no juvenile records, no dark rumors from the lower 48, just a name buried in census reports and tax files. He had once worked in accounting, lived in Olympia, Washington, married, had a child. Then everything stopped. What we do know, what the records confirm, is that 20 years ago, Finch lost both his wife and daughter in a car accident. A drunk driver blew a red light on a rain-slick street. His world ended in a matter of seconds. There was no trial, no media coverage, just 2 funerals and then silence. After that, he sold everything. His house, his car, closed his accounts, bought 120 acres of remote land in Alaska, and disappeared. It wasn't instant madness. People who isolate themselves often don't do it in a single breath. It's more like a slow, cold retreat. He started off with a generator, satellite phone, some solar. But as the years passed, even those disappeared. Finch went off-grid in the truest sense. No utilities, no Wi-Fi, no human connection beyond the general store and the occasional post office visit. The locals in town knew him only by silhouette. A gaunt man with sunken eyes and weathered skin who paid in cash and left quickly. A man who would stare at the road before crossing, as though unsure the world wouldn't explode if he took a wrong step. He was quiet, but not quite harmless. There were rumors. People said he had wired parts of his property with traps, that he'd fired warning shots at moose hunters who'd accidentally crossed onto his land, that he once threatened a surveyor with a Bowie knife. No police reports. Nothing formal. But everyone had a story, none kind. It's not hard to imagine what brewed in that cabin. A grief that metastasized into paranoia. A belief that the world owed him pain. That people, strangers, were a threat to the only thing he still controlled. His silence. When Finn and Tessa's SUV got stuck at the edge of his property, Finch didn't see two stranded hikers. He saw a breach, an invasion. And when Finn yelled, when Tessa begged, something inside him snapped. The final thread that connected him to empathy frayed and severed. His confession gave us the mechanics of the crime, but not the motive. He never said he wanted to kill. He never admitted hatred or pleasure. He simply said they shouldn't have been there. A sentence that, in his twisted logic, justified everything. Holding Tessa captive wasn't just about hiding the crime. It was about control. She had witnessed his greatest mistake. And in the isolated fortress he'd built from grief that made her dangerous. He became her captor, her jailer, her executioner by neglect. And when she escaped, he didn't chase her with desperation. He let her go like someone releasing a balloon into the wind, convinced the wilderness would do the rest. But what if she had survived? What if she had made it to a road? Would he have left? Would he have run? Probably not. Because Alistair Finch never thought he was doing anything wrong. He thought he was protecting something. His silence, his rules, his tiny world carved into the woods like a wound that never healed. He didn't fear arrest. Not really. That's why he sat calmly in that wooden chair when the troopers came. That's why he confessed. It wasn't guilt. It was resignation. To him, the world ended 20 years ago. Everything after was just ash and frost. The psychiatrist brought in during his evaluation said Finch displayed symptoms of extreme social detachment, narcissistic personality traits, and deep-rooted trauma. But they stopped short of labeling him insane, because insanity implies a loss of understanding. Finch understood. He knew what he did. He just didn't care. What turned a grieving father into a wilderness executioner? Was it the loss? The isolation? Or was that darkness always there, just waiting for enough silence to grow? We may never know. But one thing is certain. Alistair Finch didn't break because of the wild. He chose it, and in the end it became him. The search for Tessa Sullivan had always carried a cruel weight. In the early days, it was fueled by hope that she was injured, maybe lost but alive. After Finn's body was discovered, that hope shifted. It became something colder, heavier, a determination to bring her home. Not alive, but accounted for. Not safe, but at peace. When Alistair Finch confessed, he gave investigators one more grim directive. She ran northeast, into the forest, alone, in early spring, with snow still clinging to the higher ridges and the ground half-thawed beneath her. The search zone was brutal. 5 square miles of dense boreal wilderness surrounding Finch's cabin. It was a vast, indifferent tangle of spruce, muskeg, and steep ravines. The kind of place that didn't just hide people, it erased them, but they searched anyway. For 3 relentless weeks, teams of troopers, volunteer trackers, cadaver dogs, and forensic specialists moved through the underbrush like ghosts, marking grid after grid with fluorescent tape. It was dangerous, exhausting work. The terrain shifted constantly. The thaw made the forest floor a patchwork of hidden sinkholes and slick mudslides. Mosquitoes clouded every clearing. The smell of wet rot hung low in the air. And yet, every day at sunrise, they came back. Because Tessa had made it out of that cabin. She had fought for her life. She had run. And even if the odds were slim, she deserved to be found. They scoured game trails, scanned fallen logs, examined stream beds where water might have carried away clothing or bones. Drones passed overhead, and search dogs loped tirelessly through the brush, alert for any trace of human scent. Then, on August 3rd, nearly 11 months after she vanished, there was a bark, a short, sharp alert from one of the cadaver dogs, followed by another. The handler paused, listening. Then the dog froze at the base of a massive, overturned spruce. Its roots jutted into the air like blackened ribs. The team approached carefully. Tucked beneath the massive root system was a crude lean-to, half collapsed from time and snow. It was made of broken branches, moss, and bits of bark, arranged into the faintest suggestion of shelter. and inside, bones. A forensic anthropologist would later confirm what everyone there already knew. It was her, Tessa Sullivan. They found her turquoise trail jacket first, mottled with soil, but intact enough to match what she'd been wearing in that final photograph. Near her skeletal remains, they discovered a small pile of forage berries, evidence of desperate, instinctual attempt to survive, a single plastic water bottle, a few wrappers from protein bars, a broken flashlight, and then, most haunting of all, a weather-worn notebook tucked into a Ziploc bag. No word survived, just streaks of ink and the faint imprint of lines pressed hard into the pages, as if someone had written with trembling hands. The medical examiner's report gave them the grim closure they needed. Tessa had died of exposure, starvation, hypothermia, alone, likely within a week of her escape. But she made it 4 miles on foot through raw, thawing forest. She built shelter. She found food. She survived as long as her broken body could manage. She fought. And for those who had spent nearly a year searching, who had sifted through wet moss and ravines, and whispered her name into the trees, this was the only comfort they would get. They had found her. Tessa wasn't lost in some statistical footnote, some cold case spreadsheet. She was real. She had a name, a story, and now a place to rest. When her remains were flown back to Oregon, her parents issued a brief statement to the press. No interviews, no appearances, just a message. Tessa was strong. Tessa was brave. She never gave up, and neither did the people who found her. We are grateful. We are broken, but we are not without peace. Back in Alaska, the search grid came down. The flags marking where teams had walked were removed one by one. But for the officers who had worked this case, the real map, the emotional terrain, would never disappear. This was no longer just about a monster in the woods. It was about a young woman's fight to be remembered. When the last search team left the forest, when the yellow tape was pulled from trees and the maps were packed away for good, something else lingered behind, something heavier than silence. It was the weight of what had happened, what had been stolen. Alastair Finch sat in his holding cell, no longer surrounded by trees and solitude, but by cinder block and fluorescent light. He wasn't speaking anymore. His confession had drained something from him, as if, in releasing the story, he had emptied out whatever life was left inside. But the story didn't end with words. It ended with reckoning. Prosecutors wasted no time. The case was airtight. 2 victims, a detailed confession, overwhelming physical evidence, and a trail of procedural breadcrumbs that traced every horror back to one man. They charged Finch with 2 counts of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and tamper with evidence. Finn Hoffman's murder was straightforward in legal terms. A brutal, deliberate blow to the head, premeditated by action, if not intent. Tessa's was different. It carried the heavier emotional weight, and a legal nuance that sealed the case beyond any reasonable doubt. They charged Finch with felony murder for Tessa Sullivan's death, not because he struck her, not because he stabbed or shot or poisoned her, but because she died as a direct consequence of his criminal actions, his decision to kidnap and confine her. The law recognized what every investigator and juror would eventually feel in their gut. She was murdered by circumstance. Her death was a slow-motion consequence of captivity and fear, and Finch caused it. In court, Finch was barely present, a thin, shriveled man in a gray jumpsuit who didn't meet anyone's eyes. There was no outburst, no pleading, no denial, just a quiet, resigned plea of guilty to all charges. He offered no defense, no explanation, no apology. Perhaps he believed the woods would forgive him, but the law would not. The sentencing hearing was packed with reporters, officers, and a few brave members of the victims' families. There was no dramatic statement from the bench, no courtroom theatrics, just a cold, formal announcement: life in prison, without the possibility of parole. Alastair Finch would die in a cell, not beneath spruce trees or in the warm quiet of his off-grid cabin, but surrounded by concrete and steel, his final years reduced to the sterile routines of incarceration. It was, perhaps, the only justice the families would receive, but it came with a bitter edge, because justice is not restoration. It doesn't rewind time. It doesn't erase suffering. For the Hoffman and Sullivan families, justice meant finally knowing the truth, but having to live with it. Every detail, every unanswered question. Why them? Why that moment? Why did one man, so consumed by isolation and fear, decide that two lost hikers were a threat? He didn't plan it, not in the traditional sense. There was no stalking, no plotting, just a snap, a violent, paranoid break in the woods, a refusal to help, a swing of a rifle stock, and then a lie that grew heavy and monstrous. He didn't bury the bodies immediately. He didn't try to disappear. Instead, Finch locked a terrified woman in a cabin and convinced himself that isolation was control, that silence was survival. But silence is not survival. It's rot, and it grew inside his life until it collapsed under its own weight. The horror of it all was how close this story came to staying buried. If not for a donut, if not for a gas station clerk who half remembered a face, if not for a glint of metal in a glacial lake, and most of all, if not for a search team that refused to quit. This wasn't a tale of high-tech breakthroughs or Hollywood-style manhunts. It was a story solved by persistence, by slow, methodical police work, by people who looked at a cold case map and said, "We're not done," and by two brothers who noticed something odd in the water. Justice, when it came, was final. It was cold, but it was honest. Finn Hoffman and Tessa Sullivan had names, faces, families, futures. They had dreams stitched into every mile of their road trip, and they died because one man couldn't see beyond his own fear. Alistair Finch now lives out his days in a maximum security prison, another nameless number behind a locked door. He traded the forest for a cage. He traded freedom for silence. But the silence didn't save him.